This is myth 9. And that cues us in right away to a composition. It's like the titles of a Kandinsky series of paintings. If you look at composition 10 and composition 4 in Kandinsky's series of abstract paintings compositions, you know that 10 is a development quite far beyond 4. And if you looked at a photograph of 4 and 10, you would have to look for a long time to see the difference. But if you looked at the paintings and you saw composition 4 up on a gallery wall, and then you saw composition 10 on the gallery wall, you would see by the sheer epic size of 10, much less its complexity, that it just simply is the culmination. It's what Beethoven's 10th Symphony might have been had he have written one. So myth 9 indicates to us that this is a development of 8 previous lectures in a sequence on mythology. And myth indicates to us that this is the 3rd such sequence, that the first sequence of nature is overlaid by a sequence of ritual, and now a sequence of myth overlays those two. And we talked about a month ago about laminate structures, that when you bring together differing processes in a flow which is integrated, you get a laminar-like structure. Myth 9 has this peculiar quality. It has the first indication that language sinks within us, and as it does, it draws the world after it. And as words penetrate deeper into our feelings, our feeling tone, our feelings disclose the dimensionality of a world. Because words, in interiorizing themselves into our feeling tone, bring with them the dimensions of nature and also the kinetic qualities of ritual action. And so an inner world that is dynamic begins to develop, and we call this the psyche, using the Greek term. The inner world, an interiorization. We take it at this particular stage of our development that dreams are a part of the language of this inner world. And we assume that somehow this dream imagery is some kind of indication that the inner world is a very special development for us. And it takes us by surprise sometimes to observe and to note that even animals dream. Sleeping dogs wiggle their paws and whimper because they are chasing dream rabbits. Horses dream. Elephants dream. Whales dream. And so dreaming, the interior world, is a part of nature. It is not the human province set off aside from nature to dream. And animal populations even have languages, but their languages do not increase their inner world. What increases their inner world is exposure to images. And so word and image are related together, but we need to understand that image is a primordiality. Image is a part of nature, and the perceptual framing of an image so that it occurs in an inner world and then correlates to a word is a particular human quality. So that there is such a thing as a correlation of language and imagery, which is distinctive for the structuring of an inner world. For while dogs may dream of rabbits, they do not dream of raising rabbits so they have more to chase. Which is a very simplistic way of saying that language structures interface with natural imagery to produce a patterned inner world for man, for our kind. And as far as we know, this is unique for us. We're going to consider two books, another pair of books, starting with Myth 9 and running through Myth 9, 10, 11, and 12. So our technique of using paired text continues to be applicable for us. And you might have an image now for yourself that the paired texts are like a calipers. There are calipers enabling us to size, not just to measure, but to size, and to give relationality. With the calipers, one could draw a circle, one could get an approximation of sizing, one could even make measurement. The pairs of text as a tool is very, very powerful transformation of the book. The book was a symbolic indexing of language correlated with a very vast image base. In order to have a written language, in order to read a language on a page, whether it's clay or papyrus or paper, means to take the shapes of ink or the shapes of impressed clay or the shapes of carbon on papyrus, to take shapes of letters or of characters or of pictographs and to translate those shapes in the psyche into a language which then has its correlate imagery dynamically infused with the existence of a ritual comportment which holds objective structure and a nature which holds the mystery of being. The simple way to say this is that reading a language from a page is a very difficult and sophisticated process and does not date back further than about 5,000 years, 6,000 years at the most. This quality of consciousness is ostensibly called symbolic consciousness. But we need in our education to make some kind of a distinction here, some kind of a clarification for ourselves. To equate consciousness with thought is a preemptive quality which is very understandable and in some ways acceptable, but which is misleading in such a primordial, multifaceted way as to almost cripple the individual from further development. And so I'd like to give you, here in Myth 9, a little bit of a précis, a little bit of a preview of what's going on here, what the context is that we're working within, and why consciousness is quite radically different from thought. For this, we need to reconsider myth. And one of the pairs of books that we have is entitled Myth and Reality by Mircea Eliade. Now, Eliade is extremely trustworthy. Here's a photograph of Eliade in his professorial heyday with his pipe and his glasses. And here's what the man looked like when he was a young yogi for 3 years in India. And so you have before you an individual who was an extraordinary human being, who was as gutsy as he was brilliant, who was as recondite as he was outlandish. He was a real character. And he lived an intensely archetypal life. And just before he died, when he was ill, when he knew that his time was coming to a close, his office at the University of Chicago burnt down and all of his lifetime papers and library and effects and everything went up in smoke and flames. It was the ironic blessing of the intense goddess, the goddess who sometimes in medieval Western lore used to be called Fortuna, the goddess Fortune, the goddess Lady Luck, who also is the goddess of the happenstance of destiny in its chaotic efflorescence, in its fractal unpredictability. And Eliade led a life which accepted both the blessings and, if you will, the curse of this kind of energy. Curse needs to be put in parentheses here, or in perhaps footnoted in several different dimensions. The archetypal phrase is the paradox of the fortunate fall. That there is a paradox here. The paradox is that, move just a little bit so that Greg can see, thanks. The paradox is that there is a quality of turning something inside out, and that the tragic fall sometimes is necessary structurally to involute a form which, if left uninvoluted, would invite an unrealistic expectation of perfection. In common language, one can grind a point so fine that it will not be serviceable to do anything except to penetrate and scratch and maim. And so there is a point where the tragedy of instant involution is really a ironical or paradoxical good fortune. Eliade brought this kind of sensitivity to his work, and in Myth and Reality, at the very beginning, he writes about the structure of myths. And he writes that for the last 50 years or so, Western scholars have approached the study of myth from a viewpoint markedly different from, let's say, of the 19th century. That in the 19th century, myths were taken to mean fables or fiction or inventions. And he traces this quality of defining myth as fictive, as fable, as invention, traces it all the way back to Xenophanes in classical Athens, who was the first to say that the myths of Homer, the myths of Hesiod, were misleading, and that they developed qualities of fictive belief that interfered with realistic understanding for the classical Greeks. And though Eliade does not say so, many times during the history of Western civilization, this quality of emptying myths of their meaning, emptying myths of their veracity, and promoting their fictive, inventive, fabulistic quality have reoccurred. But later on in his book, after the structure of myths, after a great development in chapter 8, Greatness and Decadence of Myths, he writes here under the paragraph heading, Keeping the World Open. Keeping the world open. That on the archaic levels of culture, religion maintains the opening towards a superhuman world, the world of axiological values. These values are transcendent in the sense that they're held to be revealed by divine beings or mythic ancestors, that they constitute paradigms, absolute values, archetypes. And in fact, chapter 8 of Myth and Reality is very much the development, the summing up of the first chapter of a book that made Eliade famous throughout the world. The book was The Myth of the Eternal Return, came out in 1949, and translated into English, was put in the Bollingen series in the early 1950s. And there are 4 chapters in The Myth of the Eternal Return. The first is Archetypes and Repetition. So that chapter 8 of Myth and Reality is related to chapter 1 of The Myth of the Eternal Return. And incidentally, I did 4 lectures on The Myth of the Eternal Return about 10 years ago, and they're available on cassette. 2 of the chapters of The Myth of the Eternal Return are about the integral cycle, and 2 of the chapters are about the differential cycle. 2 of the chapters are about history, and not about the niceties of history, but about misfortune and history and the terror of history. But the first 2 chapters are what concern us today. Not so much the chapters, but just the indication of a shape to the thought of Mircea Eliade about myth. Chapter 1 is Archetypes and Repetition. Chapter 2, The Regeneration of Time. So that there are 2 interrelated, braided qualities, a pair of qualities in the integral cycle about myth that are the dominant ideas in Mircea Eliade's discussions about myth. One, archetypal pattern. 2, the cyclic regeneration of time. That myths are about bringing archetypal energies and patterns into the regenerative cycle of time, so that myths have something to do with time cycles and their regeneration on the basis of archetypal patterns that are eternal. So archetypes have something to do with eternity, and cycles have something to do with time. So that eternity infuses itself into time cycles in such a way that myth discloses the secret of this process, but that the secret of this process is not discernible in mythic terms, but is only discernible in symbolic terms, in symbolic thought. But that the kernel, the fruit of the symbolic flowering does not occur in symbols either, but occurs only later on in vision. So that there is a kind of a typology which is necessary to make sense out of what would be a very complicated scheme of relatedness. That someone like myself seeking to not so much to impart to you, disclose to you a very complex structure that has many junctures of insight, and that those junctures of insight have to do with thought forms, with idea shapes, and that those idea shapes are gestalts made in image arrays, and that those image arrays somehow come out of the mysterious process of nature. And that this entire ensemble is what is the concern classically of religion. So that somewhere in this huge mix, this complicated form that I'm struggling to disclose, not to you, but to disclose here, to share with you. I'm struggling to disclose it to myself as well as to you. My language is a struggle. My spontaneous existential endeavor now is to somehow, like a good Italian chef, to place the bowl of food in the center of the table where all of us can gain nourishment. And in my struggle of language, what is forbidding me of being clear is that I have very powerful ideas that presuppose that I know what I'm talking about. And if I talked from those ideas, I could tell you very plainly exactly what I would like you to know, but it would not be on the basis of sharing. It would be on the basis of me inculcating some kind of idea to you. And that technique is ideological indoctrination. And this education seeks to not only not do that, but to help you learn to protect yourselves from the incursions of that kind of activity completely. Because one of the great problems of the 20th century, more than almost any other century, is that we are bludgeoned almost into numb zombieism by powerful ideas that have not grown in us, but have been worked out by vast, sophisticated party committees and platforms long before any of us were able to do anything about it intellectually or physically. And we are being bludgeoned by the past. We are being clubbed into a numb submission to idiotic qualities of impossibility. We are being asked to channel our lives and our life energies and our personal qualities into channels that are shaped for purposes that have nothing to do with our lives or with ourselves. And unlike the younger generation who simply don't care anymore, who don't relate to it at all, and thus don't relate even to the capacities to make images mature into ideas at all, and thus are fodder for even more fundamental and basic demagogues who don't seek to inform a population about an ideology, but simply to manipulate them, because the techniques are there now to manipulate. There are 5.5 billion people. A really concerted group of people could manipulate the entire planet within 6 or 7 years quite easily, and they would never know. This kind of education is a serious challenge to those who will try that. As Bertrand Russell once said, man has never made a weapon he has never used. They're there, they will try. The techniques are there, they will try. But as the great J.R.R. Tolkien said, the quality of a fairy tale is distinct from a myth. A myth must run itself through its cycle, but a fairy tale has a surprise snap ending. It has an impossible discovery that brings a complete involution of all values. So that there is a paradox of a fortunate fall, even of an entire mythic world, even of an entire ideologically indoctrinated world. But it comes at the very end. That mythically, the end time, the last chink in the structure, is the archetypal point at which instant, ultimate transformational energies are available. And the challenge that we face coming up in the next 10 years is a challenge that will not be winnable until the very final moment. Because it's only at the very final moment, at the very end of a process, that its time-bound dynamic falters. And in the presence of the pause is the ultimate opportunity of the victory of truth. And that while truth can lose, if applied prematurely at any time in the development, at the very last moment, at the very last chink in that form, the patient warrior has instant, eternal victory. The Bhagavad Gita spirit warrior wins through completely every single time at that archetypal moment. And one asks, how can this be? Or why is this so? And it's Eliade's concern with mythology that discloses to us more than any other person in the 20th century why this is so. And while George Lucas did very well with the Star Wars trilogy based on Joseph Campbell's mythology and Joseph Campbell's understanding of myth, there'll come a 21st century filmmaker who will use Eliade to make a space trilogy that will just simply overshadow everything that's ever been done. There won't be any comparison at all. It'll be the difference between a pre-Shakespearean drama and Shakespeare. There'll be no contest whatsoever. Because there are actually great stories ready to be told that seem impossible, and yet they are exactly true. And that's the point Eliade makes about myth. It's not about fictions, it's about truth. Myth concerns itself with ultimate truth, but disguises itself all the time to a consciousness that looks back upon it as if it were fictive, as if it were just dreams. What looks back? Thought. Thought looks back. And in retrospect, from the symbolic power of thought, feeling seems ambiguous. Feeling seems not so precise. Feeling seems like it's subject to all kinds of modifications. There's no logic to feeling. In fact, the Greek term for the feeling tone quality of an image base forming a story is exactly the word mythos. Whereas the Greek word, using the same level of vocabulary so that we don't get into a confusion of types, the Greeks called feeling ambidextrousness or feeling ambiguity about images the language of myth, whereas the language of symbols was the language of logos. And logos is superior, the classical Greeks said, to mythos. The word is superior because the word has a logical structure. It has a logical form. that symbolic thought much more powerful. Indeed, it is. It is so much more powerful than mythic imagery that it can index it. But if one looks to the classical Greeks, with the insightful accuracy of an Eliade, it is not the displacement of mythos by logos that characterized the classical Greeks, but it was the displacement of mythos by historia. History displaced myth, not thought. There were very few Greeks that could think as clearly as Aristotle. In fact, there was only a handful. And history displaced myth in classical Athens because history was the developing edge of the differential quality of that civilization at the time. And history will always displace myth because myth is an integral, part of the integral cycle. And the differential cycle is so much more powerful when consciousness begins its movements and its resonances. It is not the logos of Plato and Aristotle that displaces myth in classical Athens, but it's the historia of Herodotus and Thucydides that displace it. And in fact, the culmination, the conscious realization of what was going on in that process is not in Herodotus nor in Thucydides, but in the great Greek historian Polybius. And in Polybius, the number one question in his great history was whether fortune still operated in human events. Tyche. Was there still this element of lady luck? Was there still this magic of the feminine fortune that is so indelibly a part of mythos? Was that still operative in history? And in fact, the whole reason for Polybius to write his history was that he was not following Greek culture anymore. The Greeks had already buried themselves into a political oblivion by Polybius' time, even though he comes only about 200 years after Thucydides. Polybius kept company with the greatest of the Roman generals, the grandson of Scipio Africanus. And Polybius watched the rise of Roman power. And he wrote a history because he was watching the rise of Rome pass through a limitation which the Greeks could not pass through. The Greeks never matured into that kind of dominant cultural form where they were able to exercise themselves over other peoples in a military and economic way, whereas the Romans did. The Greeks never set up the world civilization that was envisioned by them, envisioned by Alexander, whereas the Romans did. And Polybius watched the origins of that, was highly conscious. And the historia of Polybius is the history of the displacement of myth by history in the Roman attempts to do this. Whereas Thucydides is all about the Greeks' attempts to displace mythos by historia. But what made it possible for the Romans to do and made it impossible for the Greeks to do had a double whammy. It was impossible for the Greeks because they got sidetracked in the problems of logos. And it was possible for the Romans because they never cared about the Logos issue at all. What made the Romans politically and militarily triumphant was that they ignored a whole range of problems. They ignored the mind. They ignored the symbolic difficulties and just plunged straight ahead. And because they plunged straight ahead, they not only plunged ahead obliviously through the problems of the mind, but they never even touched the problems of vision. They never touched the problems of art. They went directly to the responsibilities of what they considered history. And Roman power built a very monumental kind of history based upon Rome. And the epithet for Rome was the eternal city. That Rome was the eternity in man's time. That the cycles of time would come and go, but the city of Rome was eternal, was always going to be there. That from the time that Numa set up the first Roman laws in 753 BC, forever Rome would be the eternal city. And so deep was the archetype of the eternal city that when St. Augustine, being a very good Roman, dismissed all of the problems that Greek thought had concerned itself with as being pagan preoccupations, we don't have to worry about the symbolic problems of the mind. We don't have to worry about vision. We don't have to worry about art. God has already taken care of all of that for us. We just have to maintain his eternal city. But the city is not Rome, but it's the city of God. And Augustine's great epic, his War and Peace, is the city of God, about transferring lock, stock, and barrel the historical power of Rome to the city of God, the transcendent city of God. And in this tremendous archetypal karate, this karate of civilizations, Augustine set up all of the flaws that were there as problems for the classical Greeks, so that they would be inherited again and again by all of the successive generations of so-called Western civilization. Whereas someone like Eliade, recognizing that archetypal eternity in the presence of cyclic time, that those two together call for a symbolic integration that cannot be ignored. Because that symbolic integration, when it is effective, opens the integral process to a mysterious quality which religion addresses itself to. The transcendent becomes real and brings with it the entire world of nature, turning it completely inside out. But that this happens only at the end of time, at the end of a time cycle, at the end of a time form. When it's reaching its culmination, exactly at that last moment, it is vulnerable to a complete transformation. The term that Jung used from Heraclitus is in entheodromia. The term that Nietzsche used was a transvaluation of all values. That at the very last moment of a time form is an instant where all of it can be turned inside out. And there is no way to defend against that whatsoever. Nothing in the entire integral cycle, no matter how powerful it is, has any effectiveness in face of one single person who could command that kind of transformative focus. So that time not only comes full round to try to complete its circle, but at the very last second when the circle of time seeks to join its beginning, the vulnerability at that last split point is that one single conscious individual could position themselves there and forbid that time form to close. One differential consciousness in the entire universe could forbid that time form to close, so that it would not regenerate. It would not come around again. There would be no rebirth of that life form whatsoever, but instead it would come to an end. Now, these are serious issues. And one asks, my God, can this be true? And the response is, what do you think that all of this hubbub is about for the last several thousands of years? What do you think religion is about? What do you think history is about? What is the Buddha all about? What is Christ all about? What is Muhammad all about? This is the stuff that everyone has been concerned about. And when we come back from the break, we'll take a look at the way in which Eliade takes a caliper and sizes it up. But for us, we're not trying to just simply understand these problems, not just simply trying to understand them from the perspective of Eliade, but we're in an educational process where we're holding our own calipers up, not only Eliade, but the complementary pair to him, Ernst Cassirer. And Cassirer's little book here, Language and Myth, is an extraordinary insight. Cassirer, who was one of the greatest minds that 20th century German philosophy threw up into the world arena. His great work in 3 volumes, The Language of Symbolic Forms, from Yale University Press in translation, still one of the monumental works of our time. But here in chapter 4 of Language and Myth, a little 99-page book, a section called Word Magic. And Cassirer points out that there are common roots between language and myth. And that the common root of language and myth is a deep insight, even beyond the power of the mind to comprehend in thought, is a visionary insight into the nature of the entire ecology that we're dealing with. For if time cycles can be stopped by a single differential consciousness forbidding them to regenerate at the contact point of the renewal, all of that can be summed up in an integrating word. It is truly word magic, as someone sophisticated as Cassirer still uses the term, word magic. The differential person at the right strategic structure of an archetypal time cycle could say the magic word, and it would vanish as if it had never happened, regardless of how many legions they have, and whether the legions are armed with spears or atomic weapons. They're completely helpless in face of the real. And so a Bhagavat spirit warrior may not look like much. Doesn't have those polished ivory 6 guns. Doesn't have that supersonic samurai sword. Might look like somebody like a Gandhi. But they're invincible. That's what makes them a Bhagavad Gita spirit warrior. They're invincible. And all of the tidal wave power of time has no power at that moment whatsoever. Which is why Tolkien pointed out, the story is never over until its point of reality is established. And that point of reality is in the hands of someone who would know. Let's take a break and we'll come back. Let's make ourselves available to some distinctions. An integral solution produces an answer, whereas a differential solution approximates boundary values. There are times when you need to search for an answer, but there are equally other occasions where an answer is irrelevant, where boundary values are of much more service than an answer might be. To a differential consciousness, answers are just early phases of concern and have no bearing upon higher order concerns whatsoever. A differential consciousness is much more interested in possibilities than in answers. And to enlarge and to have flower the boundary values, it's much more valuable than to have more and more certainty about an answer. The feeling tone, conviction, that an answer will provide what you need is indelible. We all have it. And what cinches it even tighter is the intellectual certainty that this answer is the right answer. And so the intellectual certainty, coupled with the feeling, conviction, produces an almost airtight case. The jury doesn't even have to deliberate. There it is. And yet, there's a whole ecological realm of consciousness that goes beyond this. And so this education seeks to sensitize us to a larger whole, which traditionally would be called the real. And in this real, we must recognize that while answers work in a polarized objectivity and can always be imagined, one always has the image of the answer and the correlate image of the problem then. Boundary values operate in a complementarity, just as objective, but they cannot be imagined. And so we need to use memory rather than imagination as the primary function there. We have to remember ratios of possibility in boundary values and navigate in that kind of openness rather than cinch something into some kind of labeled imagery and paste it and post it and forget about it. Myth internalizes. The mythic process is the internalization of images. It's the internalization so that the words and their imagery become capable of engendering an inner world. The objective existence out there externally becomes vivified internally. And out of this internal vivification comes a thought objectivity. And that thought objectivity is so powerful. Its integrating capacities are so complete in their cinching together of the gestalts, that once done, if we're not careful, if we're not alert and attentive, if we're not open to further possibility, we lose track of that potential. And words blind, and powerful ideas sear our sight from any further openness. And so, as Eliade points out, one of the concerns of religion is to keep us open in face of the blinding, searing quality of thought ideas, of imagery integrated into powerful symbols. And one of the functions of good symbols, of fruitful symbols, are this bivalent quality of keeping one part of the mystery open, the mystery of transcendence, that there's something more. Yes, this symbol unifies this world, but at the same time is a threshold to another realm, a further realm, a transcendence, a supernatural quality. So that while symbols cinch this world, they open up another world. And that symbols have this quality, this ambidextrous quality, which is really a complementarity. They have a visionary, undifferential function, and they have a symbolic, integral function. And later on, in symbols, we'll map this for ourselves. We'll use another pair for our ability to keep track of this, and the pair will be an amulet and a talisman. An amulet preserves meaning, cinches the integration tight together. An amulet is like a saddle on the horse. It allows you to ride with power in this world. But a talisman, the talismanic function of a symbol, is not to protect meaning, but to allow meaning to open up into unknown, undisclosed, transcendent realms. And so a talisman is interested in the magical application of the meaning. An amulet preserves the meaning here in that object, in that amulet, but a talisman is worn so that one can use that. Make the magic, make it work. And while a saddle is a good amulet for the power of the horse, the rider who sits in the saddle and uses it as a tool for him to ride and go into undiscovered places or into favorite places, uses that saddle then as a talisman. One could hang the saddle in the living room as an amulet for all the meaning that it would need. But if you don't take the saddle off the wall and use it to ride, then you're not using the talismanic power of the symbol. And what is so archetypally fundamental, as Eliade in a beautiful way discloses, is that the juncture of the archetypal, eternal quality of the symbol and its special context in terms of the regeneration of time cycles is that focus where the mythic quality of language finds its deepest cone of penetration within, to where a focus is achieved. And exactly where that focus would be achieved, where the symbol obtains objectivity, is also the point at which one closes a time form. that the flow of time, the duration of time, temporality as a process, belongs in the mythic realm. But once that temporality is matured to the point where it constellates as an idea, where it objectifies as a symbol, it then gains the timelessness or the eternal quality of the symbol. And the symbol then becomes trans-temporal. The idea is trans-temporal. Someone clever once said, there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. But what is startling is that powerful ideas come again and again. They resurface again and again. And if there are parallel circumstances, the same ideas can come back and operate again as if they were fresh and new, and they have not suffered atrophying one whit. The great concern of popular culture in our time is past lives, but a much more serious concern are past ideas that come to life again. Eliade himself is the constellator of an idea that originally belonged in Paleolithic times and came back in mid-century, largely due to Eliade's work. In the late 1940s, Eliade wrote a book on shamanism. And at the time, it was the province of a very few ethnological professors. And 50 years later, less than 50 years later, it's the weekend concerns of hundreds of thousands of people to have shamanic adventures. And while in Paleolithic cultures, the shamanic journey was a dreaded possibility for the rare individual to plug it into a middle-class life cycle. Several orders removed from Paleolithic times is to invite psychological catastrophe. Eliade himself, when he was writing his book on shamanism at the very same time, was writing his book on yoga. And in fact, in the Bollingen series, when they published The Myth of the Eternal Return, they published also in the same binding the book on shamanism, and in the same binding the book on yoga. That they formed a trilogy in a way. And that trilogy was due to Eliade himself, who's very conscious, highly differentiated individual, a person of real cosmic proportions, who reminded the publishers and the Bollingen Foundation that one has to handle archetypal energy with balance. And that if you're going to do an in-depth book on shamanism, then you need to balance it with an in-depth book on yoga, because shamanism and yoga go together. They form a pair. Because while shamanic endeavor is a Paleolithic transcendence, yoga is a Neolithic transcendence. Yoga is the shamanism of Neolithic civilization. Yoga is the technique of taming psychic energy, whereas shamanism is the hunting of psychic energy in its own wild terms. The Paleolithic concern of keeping nature wild and learning how to hunt in the wild by being wild. Whereas the Neolithic concern is how to select and tame. And yoga is about taming psychic energy. A Neolithic concern. Shamanism is about hunting with wild Paleolithic energy untamed. But the two of them together, the Paleolithic and the Neolithic, when paired together, are the concern of the symbolic. Not the Paleolithic, not the Neolithic, but the symbolic. And the symbolic is the integrating of the two together, of the Paleolithic and Neolithic, into something, another level of civilization. And the myth of the eternal return is Eliade's little manifesto for the symbolic civilization. So let's issue it together, he said. We're issuing an insight into Paleolithic techniques of transcendence and into Neolithic techniques of transcendence. We need something for symbolic techniques of transcendence. And the question that comes up is, where is this transcendence? What is this transcendence? Where is it? What transcendence from what to what? What's going on here, as Woody Allen would say? What's going on here? Could you take advice from a short man, as Woody Allen might say? It's a peculiar concern. It's both very serious and it's very humorous at the same time. It's incredibly tricky. It's so playful as to be almost corny. It's so perilous as to be instantly freezing. And in between the frozen immobility of fear and the rollicking, joyous, childlike laughter is the merging of the two into a sense of absurdity. And symbolic civilization uses the absurd where Neolithic qualities used humor, divine laughter, the laughter of the gods. And whereas Paleolithic used the freezing fear, the horrendous terror of the peril. In a Paleolithic temple like the cave of Lascaux, one finds at the ultimate juncture of the murals in the cave of Lascaux, at the far back of the cave, where there is a plunge, where the floor of Lascaux gives way, and at this plunge, there on one wall is the Paleolithic animal that would be the prey of hunters, but if you're not a good hunter and that prey turns on you, you are finished. And there is the only portrayal of the human form in the whole cave of Lascaux. And the human form that's portrayed there is Paleolithic terror. The burnt out cinder figure of the man who is absolutely garroted by terror. Not only are his arms and fingers splayed, but his penis is erect in ultimate periled fear terror. He is completely garroted by the instantaneous turn, where instead of being the hunter, he's the hunted instantly. Whereas in the Neolithic quality, there is a laughter, there is a joyousness, there's almost a childlike quality of ignoring this peril on purpose. A Neolithic celebration of this would be Halloween. And the perfect image is at a time of entering the terror of death in the underworld, the little children are going around trick or treat. We want candies or play pranks on you. And we're wearing masks of ghosts and demons and ghouls that would have frozen Paleolithic man. And Neolithic children wear them to have fun in. Whereas in symbolic culture, the juxtaposition of those two is absurd. Or as Woody Allen said, what is going on here? Is life so unbelievably perilous and terrific as to require some kind of super hunter to just even get by, one meal at a time? Or is it so easy, so completely open that we're missing it completely and it's just totally humorous? Delightful, and it's a province of children. When life comes again, it comes as babies. For humans and for animals and for plants and birds. And so the new year is a year of little tiny buds and little tiny kids and little tiny animals, of puppies and playfulness, and it happens every year. It happens every cycle. So is life serious or is it not? And the juxtaposition of those two produces symbolic, not Paleolithic, not Neolithic, but symbolic civilization. And where the Paleolithic civilization was a masculine province in terms of its requirement of courage, Paleolithic human beings would never have survived without courage. The number one ingredient, the number one source of power, courage. If you want to put it on a primordial level, Paul Tillich once called it the courage to be. It's not just the courage of facing the mastodon or facing the lion. It's facing life. The Paleolithic value is that primordial gut value of the courage to be, in face of all of this, to be, in face of terror, to be. Whereas the Neolithic value is feminine value. To relate, to prize the delicate little beginnings, that all of this potential is always there, in such proliferation that one could never even consider worrying about it. The Neolithic joy is that the molecules essential for organic life don't just occur in one precious little echelon of one planet in one star system, but occur so universally that they occur in the gases of interstellar space. That all the necessary atomic and molecular structures necessary for life are in the gas clouds in between star systems even. That life is so common in the universe that it's a part of the omnipresent structure. That life is so evanescently real that it occurs everywhere that the real could possibly hope for or wish for. But the juxtaposition of those two is serious, comic at the same time. Tragedy, comedy at the same time is absurdity. And the facing of absurdity is different from the requirement of courage in a Paleolithic sense. It's different from the quality of relatedness in the Neolithic sense. Courage and relatedness in any scale are ineffective in face of the absurd. Something new is needed. Something other is needed. And what is needed is consciousness. The necessary juice to face the absurd is consciousness. And so while religion in its amulet phase encourages courage and enjoys relatedness, it prays for the deliverance of transcendental insight, for that consciousness which can deal with the absurd in its terms. And Eliade writes about how time cycles have this quality that towards the end of their cycle, the end of a year, at the end of a millennium, the end of a whole aeon, is when consciousness is necessary. Because all of the forms that have been made, all during that year, all during that millennium, all during that aeon, they are all up for renewal. Their contracts are finished and can only continue if they are renewed. And they can only be renewed on the basis of consciousness. There are no automatic warranties anymore. Nature has this kind of automatic warranting. Who signs for the renewal of life leases for the grass? It's in the hands of Ma Prakriti, Mother Nature. She does this. And so the Paleolithic world of animals and plants has a permanently renewable contract as long as nature continues, as long as Mother Nature is happy. And Neolithic culture, with its taming of the plants and animals, has a constant stipulation that, yes, one can renew this. You need only to notice it. It is going to be renewed, but it's nice if you will notice it. But with the symbolic realm, with symbolic culture, someone has to sign. There's going to be no delivery unless you sign. And the problem that we have in our generation is that there's no one to sign. Because to see where one puts one's name is not as easy as one would think. There's no dotted line. One has to know where to sign. And you have to sign your real name. Well, who am I? Who really am I? And it's this education that seeks to sensitize us to the scale and to the depth and to the qualities that allow for some kind of phantom prism as our differentially conscious person to emerge with the kind of language capability to be able to sign one's name and let the cosmos be. This is very difficult. It's extraordinarily difficult to do. That this has not often been done is indicated to us by the great study of history that Arnold Toynbee undertook in the early part of the 20th century. He studied 28 civilizations, 27 of which were dead. None of them made it. And in fact, when one looks at the larger scale of human history, no civilization has ever been able to sign those papers. None of them have made it. Not one. And so what we're facing is a challenge which is larger than terror, which is more delicate than the finest sense of humor, which is more absurd than anything one could engender on a tragicomic stage. It's a so far impossible situation that has never been resolved. Partly because of confusion. Because the confusion always has been to fall back on tried, true qualities that have always served man and served him well, when actually the challenge is something new and the tried and true qualities are of no use. Not that they are no use, but they must be transformed from what they were into what they now are, given the developments. And the challenge comes from this process known as history. And history serves us with a challenge so infinitely complex, so delicately nuanced, that we're unaware that we're being served something for which we have to sign. And so there's this eerie kind of quality that comes now, especially in 1996, millennial fever. Not realizing that the millennium has already happened. Just delayed reaction. Already, the papers are served, and were they signed? We don't know. We don't know. Except that increasingly we're seeing that old forms don't work anymore. They simply don't work. It's not because people don't want them to work. They don't work. Because the time, form, energy is finished. Doesn't happen anymore at all. Whereas if we remember, if we have a larger context, this has happened before. There was a time 2,000 years ago where all of the ancient oracles no longer worked. Plutarch, who was one of the really conscious individuals of the first century AD, wrote several treatises that are still extant and translated into English. Why do the old oracles no longer work? They worked for thousands of years. The Oracle of Delphi no longer worked. All of the other oracles no longer worked. And Plutarch asked, are the old gods dead? How can gods die? They die because gods engender in the mythic realm. And that mythic square of eternity reaches all the way through to the culmination of vision, till the culmination of the supernatural, but no further. The gods, plural, the whole realm of the gods does not reach to the transcendent person. They can stand on their tip, never reach the differential reality of the objective person. The spiritual person is beyond the reach of mythic gods. But a human culture that is still immersed in the limits of that square of attention will not know that. And it is only the differential conscious person who is able to deal with the challenge of history. Because history is this ocean, this process ocean of the differential openness. And its movement is so vast that it brings the cosmos into objectivity. And so one asks, well, what scale of this history are we talking about? Well, we're not talking about the history of a people. We're not talking about a history of the English people. We're not talking about Greek history. We're not even talking about Western history. And we're fast learning, we're not even talking about planetary history. That what we're dealing with here is such a vast, huge oceanic process that only when we have individual persons who are completely open to ratios that are unimaginable and deal with them as if they were familiarities, everyday familiarities, will the challenge of history be met? This is a very peculiar quality. If we look at our squares of attention, we realize that there is a pair. There are two kinds. Notice the bifurcation again. Notice how running all the way through, there's this bilateral symmetry that occurs. That wherever nature is operative, a bilateral symmetry always is of structural objectivity. It's always realizable. And that symmetry, a bilateral symmetry, occurs as a mirroring or as a rotation of the one, or that symmetry occurs as some kind of transcendent realization of a wholeness. Three different modes by which symmetry manifests structure, that form happens. It happens through reflection, which is like a mirroring. It happens through rotation, a generative quality, and it happens through realization, which is a holistic, instantaneous suddenness of the gestalt occurring. This symmetry, while it occurs in nature, in the natural process, this symmetry has a different quality in ritual. The symmetry that is in nature occurs in ritual as geometry. Symmetry as a principle in nature, discoverable as a natural operative, as a function of the integral realm, functions and operates on a different order in existence, and there it operates as geometry. But the recognition of the symmetry of nature is only manifest in ritual comportment. It's in ritual that we're able to work with the symmetry of nature, but the geometry of ritual is only workable in terms of myth. One of the great problems and responsibilities of myth is to work with the geometry of existence. But just as the symmetry of nature is worked with in ritual, and ritual does not generate more symmetry but generates a geometry, so in myth, while myth is understanding and working with geometry, it generates something else. It generates what we would call, and do call, and have called, traditionally have called, a trigonometry. Nature works with the symmetry of pairs. Ritual works with the geometry of the plane, and myth works with the trigonometry of the sphere. But the trigonometrical, spherical functions are not recognizable on the mythic level, but only on the symbolic level. It's only thought. It's only thought that's able to index and understand the trigonometric functions that are generated in language on the mythic level, but are understood structurally in thought on the level of symbols. So that one might say this, that there's a four-part quaternary operating. The symmetry of nature, the geometry of ritual, the trigonometry of myth, the mathematics of symbols. And that set of four makes a set that could characterize and does in fact characterize the whole integration cycle. Now, one could codify any kind of typology And if it were consistent, self-consistent all the way through, and applicable to the real, you could use it. This scale works, though it's not the only scale possible. In fact, there are an infinite number of scales possible. But the analogy is like this. If you have a scale, say like the Western musical scale of 8 notes, the octave, you can make good enough music by the octave so that you could feel everything that you needed to feel in order to understand all the values that you needed for life. Yes, there are other scales. The Chinese pentatonic scale is completely different from the octave and function for the Chinese, and the Chinese were able to be just as sensitive as the French or the German. And they had a different musical scale. But any scale capable of functioning with that kind of completeness will do. This education will do. This typology will do. This set is self-consistent enough so that it allows for one to use it in any analytical or synthetic way necessary. But look here. Just as the symmetry of nature was not objective in nature, it had to be objectified later on in ritual, so that ritual was conscious of the symmetry of nature. And you'll find in ritual comportment always there's respect for the symmetry of nature. Always. But the geometry of ritual was recognizable only on the mythic level. Notice how as you go up each level, it recursively is able to take in what is generated on the previous phase. So the symmetry of nature is dealable with in terms of ritual. The geometry of ritual is dealable in terms of myth, but myth already engenders its own trigonometric qualities, and those have to be recognized on the level of symbols, but symbols then generate a mathematic. What recognizes the mathematic? The intuition of consciousness is on the vision level, on what used to be called magic. The ability to intuit mathematical structure used to be a supernatural function. And we must not mislead ourselves that because high school students around the world, even junior high school students, are taught mathematics, that somehow this negates all of this. There was a time only 23 centuries ago that the geometry of Euclid was one of the great prized treasures of human consciousness. It was as far as anyone with as much genius as anyone had could reach on their tiptoes. There was a time when mathematicians in Alexandria or Pergamum would number less than a handful out of the whole population of the world to be able to handle trigonometric relations. Very, very few people. But like all evolution, we have to recapitulate the various stages of the life forms right up to the present moment before that present moment can be filled and go on to the future, go on to something else. You cannot go into a future until you have fulfilled that saturation of that particular phase of that life form. There's no new phase for you until it comes out of the fulfillment. And if you're living in a regressed mode, if you settled for something less than saturation, something less than the present, then there's no evolutionary energy available. There's no way that you could go in the next step. There's no way that you could have a future. And so the religious way to talk about it, there's no salvation whatsoever if you're not ready for it. I heard a black preacher one time at a Holy Roller Church in Oakland, California. In the midst of a waterfall harangue of the congregation, characteristic of a really good black preacher. And his refrain was, "Are you ready? Are you ready for Jesus? Because if you're not ready, the devil is ready for you. If you're not ready, he's ready for you." Do you hear me? And it was that kind of incredible level of realization that the ability to have the fullness of the present so that one would have a future was not a function of some ingenuity on highfalutin level. It was on level of human beings being matured. And that black preacher in that Holy Roller Church was mature. And he was saying something to that congregation which was religiously of inestimable value. We can, from a context of Eliade, say he was encouraging them to be open to the unknown, to be ready to step into transcendental beyond. And that one of the qualities of being ready to step into transcendental beyond is to be able to know where this foot is resting. This foot is resting on the mind in its fullness. Not that everybody has to know everything. That's not it at all. But needs to have brought into integration all that is of value and of meaning to it. And if you stand on that presence, then you can step into the future. Because the future didn't exist before the moment that you stepped. And as soon as you stepped forth, the future happened. The possibility opened up. The transcendent was then real at that moment and not before. So that the renewal of a form in the future is indeed a supernatural occurrence every single time. It's never business as usual. It never automatically happens. And that was the whole concern of men and women, even back in Paleolithic times, to make sure that they did what they felt on deeper than gut level needed to be done in order for the real to continue. That's why there are paintings in Lascaux 15,000 years ago. That's why there are paintings. One of the most recent caves was found in southern France, and it goes back 30,000 years. Lascaux is midway between us and this earliest cave painting, 30,000 years ago. And we brought that in to the lecture series and showed that recent publication on that cave. And as soon as you came into the entrance of the cave, there was the registry of the hands, and there were the murals of the animals, there was the collection of the realization. Some Paleolithic form is like licking the hand and placing that on the dimensions of this world, even on thin air, supposedly. It seals, by comprehension, the present into its integral, and forbids then the opportunity of the demonic chaos to come into play whatsoever in the future, the beginning time form that's coming out of this. One of the most telling, beautiful, genius images in an Ingmar Bergman film, The Magician, a film called The Magician, where the real magician is the old woman. And the old woman sees the death symbol of the raven come looking to see what soul it can steal at the moment of death. And what does the old woman do? She licks her finger and she makes the sign of an upside-down cross in the air. She makes an inverse amulet of protection against that demonic. And by her doing this, even though the magician falls apart, even though his powers fail him, he has life again. Because the old woman has sealed the situation with real magic. She really knows. She really understands. That kind of a person is invaluable because they position their differential consciousness exactly at the strategic juncture. Not the end of the story, but at the visionary point at which the story must revolve around, the pivot of the story for it to maintain its balance. And so a differential consciousness does not listen to the myth so much, to the story so much, but intuits the essential pattern of the Gestalt and positions itself at the indispensable functional juncture where its pivot must happen. Because without that presence of that pivot, the whole structure would have nothing upon which to rest. Its rotation, no balance point at which its reflection would be symmetrical, no possibility whatsoever for the wholeness of the real to occur. And so the spiritual person is really magical, big time. And that's why the cosmos respects that kind of spiritual person. That's why the stars come out and continue to shine. Not because it's a given in terms of law of astrophysics, but because there are conscious beings doing this every single moment throughout the universe, making those presence pivots available. And in reciprocity, the cosmos continues to shine. The teacher of righteousness who wrote the book of Job about 2160 years ago had a phrase in there. He said, "There was a time which God alone saw when the morning stars sang together." And William Blake made a beautiful mystical portrayal of that. If you look it up, you'll see. The four angels of integration are all there with their arms and wings crisscrossed as the matrix of wholeness. More next week. Thank you.